Mirhom. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hi guys, I'm Mina Mirhom. Should I log onto the Zoom or?
I think it's streaming live.
They're streaming? Okay, alright, perfect. There's Abuna here. Okay, we can start. Let's take a time. Let me follow something. First, I've never been like this late to a meeting. I've been like 5 minutes late. I've never been like 2 hours late. This is really bad. But I just as explained to Nancy. Did you guys know there was a marathon going on in the city? People who are like know about things do. I was like driving through. I was like, what are these guys with capes? I was like, oh, this is the marathon. This is why all of Midtown is closed. And here I am 2 hours later. So thank you for still being here. But I promise we're not going to stay super long. But I'm going to try to distill this down. Maybe this is for your benefit too. You don't have to wait for you don't have to hear a whole hour talk on this. We're going to try to make it to the most relevant. What do we really care about in terms of our understanding of addiction, substance use from an Orthodox standpoint? First question, hand raise for this. Has anybody ever done this before? Anybody ever confessed before? Just so we know, just Coptic people, just all right. So we've confessed. If you confess the same sin more than once, there's a sense that you understand of like, I don't want to do this, and somehow I did it anyway, and this is the sense of a little bit of what addiction feels like. The first thing we want to begin, whenever we're dealing with someone, a friend, a family member, a youth, somebody who's struggling with addiction, you want to begin with putting yourself in their shoes. Putting ourselves with the position of like, we've experienced some level of addiction. Because St. Paul, and I'll show you the reference later, says like, what I will to do, I don't do. The thing that I'm really trying to do, I sometimes find myself not doing the thing that I want to do. Hence, your repeat offender confession, right? Or my repeat offender confession. Anybody get a response from Abuna? Like, dude, I'm so sorry, you already confessed that last time. We are out of absolution for that sin. No, it hasn't been the response we've gotten, right? We've gotten more the response of grace for our repeated sin. So here's the first question is, let me ask you to this. Where do we believe addiction comes from? Sorry, when I started, the first question was referencing to confession, so I would have wanted to give you a shout out. But where does addiction come from? Do we believe that addiction is a personality defect? Is it a disease? It's what do we think about that from an Orthodox Christian standpoint? Feel free to, we're a live studio audience, yes?
Can we kind of fill a gap in your life?
Okay, very good. So maybe there's a gap that you're trying to fill. So could it be a sin? Maybe, yeah, sure. Could it be something that is a disease? Could it be something biological? Something in your body? I'll tell you, the reason I'm asking this question is because here's like a little addiction struggling person. Sometimes they get a response from somebody, like that's me, this is an exact one-to-one representation of me, and saying, hey, this is just a sin, you have to pray more, right? Somebody says, no, it's actually a disease. It's not a sin at all. There's no spiritual component at all. All it is medication. Someone says, you know what, this is actually psychological, you got to tell me about your mom. You know, your mom is the problem of all things in Freud. And then, but the person in the middle saying like, help, I prayed, I took meds, I love my mom, but I'm still dying, what do I do? And this is why I begin with the question of where does this happen? There are these theories in terms of isolation. There's a really good TED Talk actually that looked at, here's like a phenomenon in terms of medicine. I had surgery once and they gave me a medication for pain that is an addictive medication. Anybody here know anyone who was prescribed a medication that could have been addictive? Something like you have a knee surgery and they give you a pain medicine. They extract your tooth and they give you a pain medicine. They looked at the way treatment was in Portugal versus in the US. And they saw that there was a difference of something. If you treat addiction or substance use disorders as a decision, just a moral failure, so every time you do something bad, you punish it, which is what we do usually in the US. Our response to addiction for a while has been, this is bad, aib, haram, punish. What they did in Portugal was, let's just treat it as a problem of isolation or an untreated pain, or there was an opportunity, most 80 to 90% of substance use disorders begin before the age of 18. And they saw a big difference in the way people responded to treatment. Because here's what I want to give you. If we get nothing else from the talk, for this is like the the TED Talk version of this, the speed round. Have you ever heard of this quote where St. Gregory says the unassumed is the unhealed? Or when Christ was incarnate and took flesh, in order for him to heal every part of us, he had to truly take on every part of us. The personality piece, the emotional piece, the mind, the body, everything. He didn't pretend to be fully human. He was full in everything. So for that reason, there are 4 B's that I want to share with you about where addiction comes from. And this is why we have to understand this very clearly as Orthodox people. The first one is the brain or the body. Let me ask you this. I was with a church yesterday who asked a very important question. Can I be born more likely to suffer from addiction than somebody else? Is this possible? Yes? Who's for no? That doesn't make sense. So let me ask you the follow-up question. Why would God create me this way? Why would God create me more likely to have an alcohol use disorder or alcoholism than you? How is that fair? Why would God do that? Any thoughts? Have you ever been asked that question? Have you ever been asked the question of why would God create a person like this, blank? Something that's not good, something that's not the way that it should be. Any thoughts on that? Yes. Maybe it's like overcome. God's like, oh, come on, you can do it. Yeah, maybe. Maybe, yeah, maybe it's like you could be addicted to tasbihah. Like, good, okay, awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, in his wisdom, maybe people are able to overcome. He's not creating you giving you more than you can handle, yes?
Because we help other people who are struggling with the same thing.
Very good, yeah. St. Paul says like he comforts us in our affliction so we can comfort others in their affliction. Very good. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
A lot of the times we need to understand that we don't always know the why.
Uh-huh.
And we're limited and God's unlimited. So it's kind of the same answer you would give to someone that asks, well, why does God allow suffering in the world?
Right.
Why does God allow mishaps to happen?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, sometimes it's to bring you closer to Him. Sometimes that challenge brings you, makes you a different person. But
Right.
sometimes you just don't know the why. And I
Fair.
think sometimes that's
Fair, totally fair too. Sometimes it's like, you know what? We don't know. We trust God's wisdom. It's like the end of Job, right? That little confrontation. God's like, where were you when I created the stars? And Job's like, oh, I wasn't anywhere. I don't know. I wasn't even a thought in my parents' head. True. And sometimes we can spiritualize it and we say, oh, it's because of this, because of this. All good stuff. But I just want to take you back one step to the question of why would God create someone this way? God would not create someone this way. God, in fact, does not create someone this way. Sometimes we get asked the question and we reply to the question without challenging the premise of the question. Is the premise of the question true that God created us fallen? No, right? Why would God create nature fallen? Why would God create animals with the natural thing for a lion to attack a person? That's not the way God created a lion. That's not the way God created my genetic code. That's not the way God created me, right? Why does this happen? We go back, right? We were all liturgy this morning where it says, where sin entered the world by the envy of the devil. What did sin do? Sin changed my genetic code. Sometimes we miss this part. Sometimes we think that when people tell us, they frame sin as if like, you get like a ticket. Have you ever gotten a ticket before? You get a ticket, it didn't change like the structure of how you drive. It didn't change your car, it didn't change you. You got an offense, and now you owe $100 to the city of New York. That's what we think sin is sometimes. But sin is not that. Sin is something that entered into the world and changed the nature of the world. That's why the perfect genome that God created, genome meaning genetic code, the little blueprint for how we come out, that was perfect, now comes out defective. Now I can be born with an extra Y chromosome that can make me more violent and I'm more likely to go to jail. You know that? Isn't that weird? Now I can be born with something in my genes that can make me more likely to do something like alcohol. Does that make sense? All the things you guys said are true in terms of like what could God do with that and how we can handle, all those things are really true. But just one step further in terms of where this comes from. Okay, so having said that, because the body needs to be redeemed, God has given us medication for the body. Medications like naltrexone or Suboxone, or it's even new data on the GLPs, Ozempic, and these medications are now showing that you can treat a lot of addictions with them. The belief, what is it that we understand about ourselves and our world and our environment? So in my mind, my being, aka my soul. Anybody know this quote? What is the medicine of immortality? This is a cool, put it on your fridge kind of quote. This is what St. John Chrysostom calls the Eucharist. He calls the Eucharist the medicine of immortality. So the healing of my soul, the healing of my understanding, the healing of my surrounding, right? In order for me to be really healed from something, it's not going to be just my soul or just my brain or just my understanding. It has to be all of these. Make sense? The reason this is important is because sometimes we can go too much onto any one of these. I was with parents yesterday and they were saying, my 15-year-old's doing drugs. So what I did is I took away all of my 15-year-old friends. You know what they're going to do if they're convinced that drugs are good? They're going to find some other idiot who does drugs and go hang out with them. So cutting off their friends, changing the background is one piece, but it's not the answer. What is the belief? What is the being? What is the body? Because sometimes too, you can do all of these. You can be praying, you can be healing all the rest, but the body is physically addicted to a substance in the same way. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. This is just important framing. This is a beautiful quote where it says, do you commit sin? Enter the church and repent of your sin, for here is the physician, not the judge. Here is one who is not investigated, one receives remission of sins. So again, this is just going back to the idea of Christ is the physician of our souls and bodies, and because he is, have you ever been to a specialist, super specialized person? I know one doctor who specializes in hands, and just the thumb is mostly, their work is particularly they're very thumb expert. If you go to somebody who's a doctor who wants to take care of your whole self, a primary care, holistic doctor, that's who Christ is as a physician of our souls and body. I might skip this part, but depending on, you tell me if I should go into it or not. This is a little bit more nerdy. This is just about where the brain develops an addictive pattern. The one part that I thought was interesting here is, something like my man said, God did develop a little bit of a propensity in us that when something good happens and dopamine comes in the brain that says, this is good, do it again, that can be for prayer. That can be for good things. That can be, they even measured it for things like service. There was one really nice study in sort of later teenage, early 20s years, and they compared service and giving to medication, and it did just as good. The idea of being able to give of yourself can have a physical impact on your brain. Noteworthy here part is with substances. Did you know, for example, cocaine or heroin can increase the release of dopamine is sort of the feel-good substance in the brain. Something like methamphetamine, can you guess if these medications or if these substances sit 5 or 10 or 100-fold? Well, we don't have a lot. It could be up to 1,000-fold for something like methamphetamine, which is wild. But if we were in Arizona, that's more. In terms of our framing, how we understand addiction, because the more we understand it, the better we understand how to approach it from an Orthodox standpoint. Quick note on this is one of the things that we believe that are incredible in our faith and the way that God designed the brain is that these changes that we make can actually change the way the brain happens, the way that connections are made, this idea of neuroplasticity. Have you heard this idea before? Hand raise, or hand raise for I have not heard it before. Hand raise for I'm super tired, just don't, just leave me alone with this nerdy science stuff. I'll distill down the nerdy science thing as this. 10 years ago, we used to think your brain is your brain. That's it. Halas, you're stuck. Now we know that your brain can grow. Your brain can form a new connection. If you're trying to get to this church, right? Maybe you had a usual route. This road to this road, all the roads are closed. You find some other road. The brain has information highways like that. This is the way that I'm going to connect. I'm going to tell your elbow to, elbow that guy in the face. This is the highway of information. That highway that it makes, it can form a new path of information with changes that you made in the 4 B's that we talked about. So changes in your soul. Like, for example, let's say in Lent, and we're trying to develop a new spiritual habit. But khalas, like I used to, for the past year, I don't have this spiritual habit. I don't pray my aygibt every day. When you develop a new spiritual habit, it actually changes the neurons, the connection in your brain that says, let's have a new road, a new path. Tying this into, there's a beautiful passage in Tasbihah, where it talks about when Moses, when Moses and the children of Israel, and they were going up to the sea, and then he said, all right, we're going to go through, and there's a beautiful passage that says that they walked in an uncharted road. This was never a road before. This was just a sea. This was water. But God opened up a road where there wasn't a road before. Your brain can kind of do that. It's not stuck in its ways. It can actually grow, which is super cool. Change begins with identity. What do I mean? I'm going to give you an example from a study. They looked at 2 people. They said one person, they were both trying to reduce cigarette smoking. One person, when offered cigarettes are making a comeback now for some reason. I see a lot more like actual cigarettes versus vaping. And they said, when you're offered a cigarette, so you be my example number 1, you say, no thank you, I'm trying to quit. And then when you're offered a cigarette, you say, no thank you, I'm actually not a smoker. I don't smoke. Is there a difference in 2 responses? What they found was, even though they both smoked the same amount beforehand, but the way that you understand your identity, if you say, my identity is I'm somebody who smokes, but I'm trying to quit, versus saying like, no, this is not me anymore. I don't smoke. This is part of the reason why even the language that we use in substance use, we don't use words like, this person is an addict. Or we don't even use, if you think about it, in the church, we want to identify ourselves less with the behavior, the sin. We are Christ-like, and we struggle against a sin. We are sons and daughters of God, and we struggle against things that are not in our nature. This identity piece is really important. How do we change a habit? How do we guide a loved one, a friend, somebody that we care about to changing a habit? 4 little C's that I'm going to share with you. The cue, the craving, the conclusion, and the compensation. I'll speed through it. First, the cue. Have you ever been to the mall or anything like that? Have you seen this evil enterprise called Auntie Anne's pretzels? Right? Especially in the Siyam, they're undeniable. You just had like kushari, but like you could smell it from here. A cue is something that involves the senses. The smell here, what you can feel, touch, hear. When we're trying to change a habit, form a new one, or walk somebody through having a new habit, think about first how they're engaging the senses. This is part of why in the fast, and the church actually gives us this like pathway with this, of retaming our senses. Cue is. This is what initiates a routine. These are some examples. In addition to senses, time, or a location, somebody could walk by and be like, "Oh, I remember, this place." Or whenever I felt this way, I've had patients tell me this. When I felt this way, here's a classic example. If you see like a rom-com or something, right? Somebody after a breakup, they go bust out a big tub of ice cream, right? Here's the substance. Every time I feel sad, it's Ben and Jerry's. We have a really good business model for that. Sometimes it's people or a preceding action. Then this is really key. I saw a video once that said this. If there was like a big new, what's like a big amazing behavior that you wish by the end of Lent that you can have? Can you give me an example of one? That by the end of Lent I can juggle or bond, like something that you think like you've worked on with your spiritual father. Any examples of something that you'd love to have by the end of Lent? I can fast until 3. I can say words when I'm asked. Anything you want. Learn a hymn, مثلا. Let's say like learn a super long hymn, and let's take it to the extreme. If I can learn all of the hymns of Holy Week, ambitious goal. Like what's the likelihood if you ask me to do that? Like 2-3%. Like I'm a background singer kind of guy in Holy Week. I'm like, I love this. But what's the likelihood if I told you that you either learn all the hymns of Holy Week or everybody that you care about will not be here past Holy Week? Would you crush the hymns of Holy Week? Would you be Ibrahim Ayed II? 100%, right? Oftentimes, why we do this, the behind the craving physically, behind the cue, not just the senses, but the motivation behind an addiction is something we want to figure out when we're interacting with somebody that we're serving or a loved one or a friend. For example, when we're speaking with someone and say, like, you're smoking a lot of weed. I get it. That must be doing something for you. Tell me what it's doing for you. Tell me about your why, right? When we take that approach of understanding somebody and getting a sense of what their why is, walking them through a different why can be very powerful. Are we cool so far? Am I going too fast? Yes.
Could that ever like backfire?
Tell me.
Like let's say you're trying to like say why, like they're so convinced with their why that it's like hard to like unconvince them with different.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes to like, what's the point of my conversation? What's the aim, right? In the aim of my conversation, it's not necessarily to talk somebody out of what they're doing. Like I'm going to hear your why, and I'm going to tell you why your why is not the best why. I'm going to give you a better one. It's more so first for me to understand what it is, and for you to know, like, I care about hearing you out and knowing where you come from and knowing you've got your reasons. And then as we do that now, you know how when Christ asked questions, he asked over 100 questions in the Gospels. He would ask you a question and try to get to see something in a different way. For example, somebody would tell me, part of my why is this really helps me sleep. You can't convince me otherwise. Like, it'll help me sleep. I'm like, cool. Makes sense. Helps you sleep. I'm not going to convince you otherwise. Is there a possibility that there could be another medication that could also help you sleep? That could be cheaper? No, it's impossible. Okay. Is it possible that there'd be something else that has less side effects? Oh, well, maybe. Is it possible that, you know what I mean? Like having more of the probing into the conversation, not so much like, here's your why, I don't like it, I don't agree with it. The easiest way to shut down information from people is like, here's your why, but here's like my fact against your why. But rather, if I know I'm getting into a dialogue with you, you know I care about you. You know, that's how we can steer somebody towards a behavioral change with encouragement too. There's a big technique we're not going to get into today called motivational interviewing when it comes to substances. And part of that can be, even if someone says, you know, and priests do this with us, right? If you say to a priest, Abuna, I can't believe, you know, 3 days after confession, I had the same dumb thing that I hated. Abuna often will be like, oh, that's great. So 2 days you didn't? That's awesome. Like, you know, that's great. God really like worked with you those days, and we're going to pick up right back and we're going to continue. So that's kind of how we want to go in reinforcement, the encouragement piece. All right. I'm shooting for 10 more minutes and we'll be done, I promise. Any questions, other questions so far? The reason I'm emphasizing this is understanding, because even with understanding the genetic piece of like, we can be genetically predisposed because our genes are broken. There's still a role for choice. There's still like the choices that we make, but we don't want to only rely on choice. In the church, with our spiritual decision making, the reason why the church always gives us all of these other components, that you don't want to only be relying on your willpower. Because we believe, in our humility, that our willpower is unreliable, right? That's why you rely a little bit more on community, a little bit more on grace, and a little bit more on spiritual guidance too. When we take an action, I'm going to skip this for a second, in making things bite-sized. This part I wanted to just mention for you in terms of, this is the encouragement piece. I always love to think about this. You know, we always think about the church, our Coptic Church, existing because of who? Like, who brought Christianity to Egypt? Is there somebody that you can think of in the scripture that if it wasn't for this guy, there would have never been a St. Mark? Good thought. Somebody else. Somebody more directly tied to St. Mark. Yes, my man. Why Barnabas?
Because he
My guy. That's big up. That's a good one. Why Barnabas? Barnabas, his name, by the way, literally in the scripture it says he is the son of encouragement. Son of encouragement. There was a point where St. Paul and St. Mark got into a fight, and St. Paul said, send this little baby home. Like, this kid's like, he's not ready for the big leagues. Go home, we don't need you. And Barnabas was like, no, this kid's got something. He's got something special, this guy. He's going to make a little Coptic church. The reinforcement piece of a small habit of saying to somebody how you can speak sort of encouragement to them in this process is everything. That's the difference between St. Mark being somebody you never heard of and somebody being the founder-ish or sort of the person who brought our church into. That's why small wins, small things that we reinforce really go a long way. I mentioned this a little bit what St. Paul says to us about real addiction, like in the spiritual sense. Yes?
You're speaking in the sense like if someone has an addiction and then their friend is kind of telling them advice or like their father confession.
Yeah.
But what if someone is still too embarrassed to kind of share their addiction with someone? So should they practice telling these things to themselves? Like how, that's going to be a bit hard to have them like practically.
Yeah. Very good thought. Yeah, if I'm like, because shame is a huge part of this, right? Addiction. This is why if I'm experiencing this, the first place I go, if I feel like addiction is my own moral, personal, spiritual failure, then I'm super ashamed of it, right? Then I'm like, I don't want to even talk to Abuna because I'm too ashamed of my own decisions, right? So the first thing I would do if I'm struggling with an addiction is go back and think, where is this coming from, right? Again, going back to those 4 Bs. Because I understand those 4 Bs are where it's coming from. So now I can say, well, all right, this is not something I could do on my own. And I need to be able to have the encouragement to say, there's a part of this that is in my body that, I can't control my brain chemistry. There's a part of this that's my environment. I need a little bit of guidance on how do I speak to person, places, or thing, kind of thing. There's a part of this that's like spiritual nourishment, right? When St. Paul, we may not know this verse, this is more like of our parents' generation, they usually scare them out of taking communion. But have you ever heard this verse where when St. Paul is speaking to people in Corinth and is saying, because of this, many of you are ill and even fall asleep. There's this passage where he talks about the Eucharist and like how we are very mutanishin when it comes to the Eucharist. We're like, oh, well, this means this is of no value, of no consequence, no substance. And sometimes we don't know what the physical impact of that, of taking something very sacred and making no meaning of it. The tie-in here is that our spiritual health is connected to our physical health. The same way, do you know that your psychological health is connected to your physical health? Like that part used to be a big stretch for us for a while, but now we kind of understand it. That if somebody, for example, is incredibly anxious, like you're on 10 for a whole year, physically that can begin to compromise your immune system, right? Like your brain, because it's the headquarters, the HQ of everything, it begins to impact the rest of your body. Same way, our soul begins to impact our physical body, like we talked about here. The brain too. Like our soul can impact the brain. So all that to say, if I'm the one experiencing this, I go back and say, there's a part of this that needs me to encourage myself to understand that this is something bigger than me. And there's a part of this that needs to understand where these 4 Bs come from so that I can have less shame, less, prodigal son Sunday here of why I can come home to the team and say, like, I'm not ashamed of that. That's why that passage from St. John as well, Christoph, of saying, like, when I go to a doctor and I'm sick, I don't want to be ashamed of the fact that I'm sick. I want to be like, I'm sick, that's normal. Of course I'm going to get sick. And you're the doctor, of course you're going to fix me. That's your. But the role of shame, I'll summarize one quick sentence too for the sake of time. The difference between shame and godly repentance is this. Godly repentance is I did bad. Shame is I am bad. This is like very simplistic. You can say this to like 4th graders, but we struggle with it. We all struggle with it because we all do dumb things or bad things or things that we don't want to do. When I begin to say, internalize the bad thing of like, I am bad, that's shame. Now I'm going to be too ashamed to have godly repentance versus I did a thing that is contrary to my nature, to who I am. Make sense? Okay. We're in the last 5 minutes. I'm not going to go through all of the rest of the slides. I had a lot for you, but basically the part that I want to show you, besides the pretty brain pictures, let me show you the part that's I'll fly through this in like 1 minute, which is brain picture, these SPECT scans that can show you that the brain literally changes with substances. Okay, like this. Right here is heroin, methadone use, THC, which is marijuana. Side note, sidebar, just because this is something that is even bigger now. Actually, you know, the number one substance that was used in America for a long time was what? If you have to guess on a substance. Alcohol. Alcohol is number one. What recently replaced alcohol as number one? THC. Marijuana just won the cake. Why is that? Because it became more legal, and there's now a multi-gazillion dollar industry. And the lie around that is like, this is natural, it's from the earth, right? It's totally benign, nothing happens, everything's amazing. And that's entirely untrue. Besides the fact that it changes the actual physical brain, I'll show you some things in a second. But this is from like an informed consent kind of standpoint, right? This is just not telling people, hey, drugs are bad, but telling people, just do you know what this does? Like I'm on TikTok a fair amount, and all I see on TikTok is like, use this supplement and this will change your life. This will fix things. I'm like, oh, no, this supplement can kill you. Well, people don't know that, but it's on their TikTok shop. You had a question?
Is there like a different substance that would have a different addiction rate?
Yes.
Say alcohol would make you addicted faster or stronger than, let's say, weed or
Yes.
drugs?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So there is a little bit of a ranking. So for example, I was looking at a study yesterday between cocaine and MDMA, or like Molly, which is like a street drug. The drugs that flood your system with a whole bunch of dopamine, like cocaine for example, are more likely to make you more addicted faster. Versus drugs that can flood your brain with dopamine, but also add a little bit of serotonin, less addiction, less quickly, but you can still be addicted, like MDMA does that once on dopamine and on serotonin. It doesn't mean that they both don't make you addicted. And there's a question always about marijuana of like, what is the physical addiction symptom? It's not like you're not going to have withdrawal symptoms. You're not going to have, can you overdose on marijuana? What we do see now over time is people still form a dependence on marijuana, on a substance. The same way that alcohol is different because you form a physical craving for it. You form a physical dependence. And if you stop drinking, let's say if you're drinking alcohol heavily every day for a long time, and you stop one day, that's actually dangerous because the body has now developed a dependence on it. You can begin to have seizures, and it can actually kill you. In the same way, because alcohol and, have you heard of medications like Xanax? They work the same way. There's a part of the brain called the GABA system, which helps you be more calm. This is one of the reasons why if somebody is very anxious and they have a couple of drinks, they will be more calm for that moment. Yes?
How about drug fentanyl? Like, I hear it's very deadly.
That's right. Fentanyl is very deadly and very addictive. So fentanyl is an opiate. That's in the family of heroin and the prescribed family of like Percocet and things like that. What the problem with fentanyl is, because it's so strong, people don't often even know that what they're taking is fentanyl. Sometimes somebody will say, well, I bought some Xanax from somebody on the street, and I didn't know it has a little bit of sprinkle of fentanyl. So now they took it, not realizing they were going to overdose, and they wind up in our emergency room because it's the equivalent of taking like a whole bunch of heroin all at once, right? And obviously heroin and things in the opiate family are very addictive. And it's part of the reason why I mentioned for you in the 4 Bs, the medicine part. Because alcohol is very addictive, and we in our community actually don't know this well, that there are medications that someone can take as a pill or as a shot once a month that can help you stop drinking alcohol. And there are medications that you can take that can help stop fentanyl, help stop Percocet, help stop, heroin. And I treat a lot of people who are very high functioning people, who are professionals, but got prescribed the medication after they got a surgery and then wound up developing an addiction, but did very, very well with medication. So I wanted that part, because we still do very poorly with this. Right now, if people go into the emergency room, less than 10% of people who are coming in there for a fentanyl overdose wind up getting medication treatment for that. So like in America, we suck at this still. The fentanyl part. The fentanyl, heroin, opiate, Percocet part, yeah. But great question. Any other question? He was feeling himself out of here. He was like, I know my Fenties. Any other questions about that part? We'll run through for the finale, basically. These are just a visual. But this is the part I like to end on, or sort of remind us of, is that the brain, like we said in the beginning, recovers, right? The brain has a remarkable ability to recover. So even if you have polysubstance use, but there's a period where you're not using substances, it begins to get better. It begins to recover. And same for things like depression. If after it's treated, the brain begins to recover there as well. Where did I want to stop? Oh, this is just a more emphasis on the marijuana piece, but I don't want to belabor that. The part I want to belabor for you, yeah, I think that's good. Whoops. Sorry, I know I sped through. Just want to see if there was anything I wanted to emphasize for you before we go. Well, a quick note on this maybe. Because we talked about how medication is something that we use. The 12-step program, this was sort of a Christian-based idea. And a part of this, I've always looked at it as like 12 steps of repentance. And it helps us, I think, for time of Lent and how we approach addiction in general. The first thing in terms of how we approach this is that we will not rely on our willpower. We don't rely on repentance on just me. We rely on who God is. And second one is really looking at God. And number 3 is a purposeful decision to be able to come to God. And then the 4 is the self-evaluation piece. There's a homily in Holy Week. I think it was Saint Shenouda who says, make sure that each night, right? Remind me of the reference here. Make sure that you're spending a time of searching yourself. If you're not doing that, then you're going to not be able to make the most, of this week. So with that self-searching, then we're able to come to God. With that, the humility to be able to continue asking God for direction, and then to work on the consequences of our addictive behavior too. So anyway, without going into all the detail of it, I just wanted for you that this is a nice thing to be able to think about, that how God heals us, it's a process, and that process involves our entire selves, and a part of it can involve how he heals the body, how he heals the mind, how he heals the soul, how he heals our decision making. All of those things need to be healed. It's not just one, right? And whenever somebody, if a fitness influencer on your TikTok says to you the way that you can change your behavior, forget about all this stuff. All you got to do is go to the gym. You'd say, no, that's wrong, right? For us, as Orthodox people, we always have a balanced view of all these things, addiction being one of them. Cool? That was efficient. Questions? Yes?
I had a question about early the cues
Mm-hmm.
and of changing a habit. What if the cue for the person is something that they can't avoid?
Mm.
One of the cues is the environment,
Mm-hmm.
the people that you're around, or it's just something that's unavoidable. So and like you said, we can't focus
Mm-hmm.
We can't do it on our own. So like, would you kind of like tell a person like that when the cue for that habit or behavior is always there?
Right. What do you guys think? Let's say a cue or like a trigger, right, is like, my brother, my sister, my family member. This is where you can get some bad advice and be like, well, leave those guys behind. Just be out, just take the cues out of your life. And St. Paul has this passage where he says, like, when I'm giving you direction about something, I'm not saying that you avoid, he was talking abstaining from the way that you interact with people who are essentially doing really wild, sinful stuff. But he's like, I'm not saying you do that with like the whole world. If you did that, you'd leave the whole world in general. My point here is, sometimes we wouldn't be able to artificially craft our environment so that there's no triggers, that everything is great, that our family is wonderful, that our friends are supportive, that our job is great. But the thing that you do is say, all right, so here's one lever that's hard, that my environment is like this, so I'm not able to change my environment. Is there anything else that I can change? That's why we give people 4 levers of choices. Well, here now my environment is tough. What's going on in terms of my belief? What's going on in terms of my emotional response? There's a nice book that I often think about in reference called Man's Search for Meaning that was written by a guy who was in the Holocaust. Holocaust, like bad, environment-wise, not great. He was able to say, either I'm going to focus on the fact that I can't control my environment, Holocaust bad, or I'm going to focus on what is a choice that I have, what a response that I have to the bad environment. Always remembering that we have agency, we have choice. But now I refocus, I can't change this person, I can't change their attitude. What is my emotional response? Based on these 4 things, the 4 B's that I said. Maybe there's something in the way that I believe. Maybe there's something in the way that I relay my spiritual health because of this. Maybe there's something that I need to do in terms of my physical as well as my brain. So when I don't have choices in one area, I think about where are the other areas that I do have choices. The part that we get stuck in, most of us, is we say, this thing is bad and it's not changing. My job stinks and it's not changing. My parents, I keep telling them, don't keep doing this, and they keep doing this. My brother, I say, hey, don't punch me in the face. He keeps doing it, Trying to always just change the external world will make us more and more frustrated. Trying to remember, where do I have agency choice in my response is, and I'll give you a nice story from the Desert Fathers that's like the opposite. And this is more of the spiritual answers that you guys gave me. One time there was a monk that went to his abbot and said, like, I want to leave this monastery. I hate it here. And the abbot was like, what's wrong, bro? Why are you so dramatic? He was like, everybody here is a saint. Everybody here is so loving, so kind, so forgiving. I never have a chance to practice forgiveness or patience or something spiritual because everybody's amazing. Like, I hate it here. I want to go somewhere where someone is going to be offensive to me so I can forgive them. Somebody's going to step on me some kind of way so I can be gracious. So there's that too. We always have the agency of response and choice. That's where we need to look to. Any other questions or thoughts on fentanyl? No, we're good? It's a life-changing thing, I think, if we, as a community, just... Because chances are you will encounter a young person or an old person struggling with addiction, and if we can gear them to how Christ can give us healing in a total way, it's a life-saving thing. Okay, yes? Yeah, what age suffers from what age? How old are you? 23 is the biggest... hey man, I report the facts. I don't know what to tell you. There's a lot of fentanyl in 23-year-olds. I'm in yeah, no, I'm joking about that, but like, statistically, he's like, I'm clear. Statistically, more often under 18 is when substance use will begin. But what we saw, especially there are all these settlements now with Purdue, the company that made opiates, for example, because they created a wave for people who were older, 20s, 30s, 40s, people who never would have developed addiction to begin with. So the substance kind of varies. When you're in your 20s, there's a lot of alcohol use, there's a lot of marijuana use that becomes problematic. People a little bit older, depending on like life stage and life event. The big thing that I see in terms of pattern is the isolation piece. This is why I gave you that reference about Portugal and the way they look at addiction. Because for us, the more disconnected we are from community and the more we have to find a way to self-soothe, to find a way to, to be able to feel better, basically. The more we look for things, or these things find us. So that's definitely a factor there. Yes?
What do you say for let's say less serious addictions,
Such.
YouTube addiction,
Yeah.
Instagram addiction?
Yeah, I was actually looking at that yesterday because there's like smartphone addiction in general is like becoming more of a thing. It's becoming like more prominent. Video game addiction just went into the way we diagnose or sort of categorize addiction, something called the DSM. It went into that. We're like, oh, this can be a thing. And there are places that are opening up like rehab centers for that because it could be so extreme. I've seen patients, for example, a 15-year-old who's on a video game for 10 hours a day. It's like, all right, if you're on that 10 hours a day, you're not doing nothing else, right? Or somebody who's on Instagram, TikTok, several hours in a given day. Because obviously the phone is like much more powerful than we are, right? Our parents have an addiction maybe to Facebook. We have an addiction to all the other things, TikTok, Snapchat, and the like. So those can actually be very debilitating too. They can come to a place. One of the ways that we classify addiction, the same way we classify mental illness in general, I might have shared this with you guys in the beginning or at some other talk before, is these 5 Ds. Does this sound familiar to anybody? 5 Ds of how we classify this, and one is duration, how long this goes on. 2 is depth, how intense this addiction becomes. 3 is daily. Am I on the phone, for example, daily for a long amount of time? And then 4 is duty. How much this begins to impact my work. So now I'm falling behind on work or school because I look up and next thing I know, I've been on TikTok for 2 hours, right? And then lastly is danger. Sometimes an addiction, by definition, begins to be dangerous. Like there was somebody I saw in the ER last week who had no intention at all of, overdosing, but she wound up taking too much of something that she thought she was always taking, but she had a new dealer. And there was a little bit laced and had a little bit of something that was different. It was fentanyl. He's like the fentanyl rep for this even. Come to him with all your fentanyl questions. So that's in terms of how we classify it. So because of that, we don't want to think that these are like benign, nothing kind of addictions. We want to be more vigilant on them, and there are some like specific ways that we can approach them. Whether, like, what do you do? Some of the things that I saw this past week, because I was looking at this exact question. For some, it's here is the let's say the app that I'm using, and I have to delete that app, or I have to only use it on a web browser. For some, it's like, okay, I'm on my phone as a way to distract myself, or like it goes back to what's untreated, that there's an anxiety underneath that I have to treat the anxiety that's underneath, depression that's underneath, because I'm going always to this thing, and the algorithm will continue to feed me more of the same. Sometimes the algorithm will continue to feed me more depressive, sad, things to continue to have me on the algorithm. In some rare cases, you could actually, not rare even, but in some cases, we may need to look at medication because the addiction to the smartphone may look like it's the symptom, but it's not the underlying issue, right? The underlying issue could be, like I said, an untreated anxiety or depression, but it's just looking like an obsessive kind of behavior with a smartphone. So there could be an underlying OCD even that's going on there. So once we look at the 4 Bs and we say, all right, I changed my environment, I changed how much access I have, I changed how often, I looked at the screen control of how many hours I'm on the phone, all that kind of stuff. Then I say, okay, the next step is maybe I need someone to weigh in for a professional perspective on this. That's what I often would recommend. Yes? like cold turkey or replace. In general, it's good for us to, this is both for habits, spiritual patterns, as well as apps, of how we can replace. Like replace is a good idea, right? Of like, we don't want to just have a vacuum of, okay, I'm just not going to do this thing. But sometimes in replacing, this is why it helps to have like a coach or someone who's going to walk me through the strategy for me. Because if I'm spending 5 hours a day, for example, on Instagram, you say, well, I'm not going to spend 5 hours on Instagram. I'm going to wean myself down to 4 hours on like a different app. That may not be getting me much, but it's like, again, going back to like, what's my why? What do I find? If I can step back for 1 second and say, what is Instagram doing for me? You know, it's doing for me, it's giving me entertainment. It's giving me a way to be distracted. It's giving me a way to not feel like I'm dealing with the masayib around me. Okay. Is there another way that I can deal with that for 1 hour of those 4? Is there another technique I can have? Another tool I can use? Putting in a little bit of a replacement so that I can see, how do I see if I'm addressing what's beneath the behavior? The part that we always struggle with, or oftentimes struggle with, is just trying to change the behavior like just on the surface. When we change behavior on the surface, we struggle because we're not looking for what's beneath the surface of the behavior. So I have to ask myself, if I'm changing any kind of behavior, what is one thing, the feeling behind the behavior? Am I on this because I am afraid? Am I on this because I'm lonely? Am I on this because I'm isolated? Am I on this because I'm angry? The feeling behind the behavior will direct how I replace more effectively. But sometimes, in some ways, just to answer your question more directly too, for the sake of time, sometimes a detox helps too. Like we're not able to, it's not a bad thing for us to say, I'm going to give myself a shot at an hour, or let's say now, 10 minutes where my phone is actually off, and see how that feels. See how much panic that induces in me. You know, see if I have a stroke that like, who's going to email me? Like nobody, it's fine. You know? So getting into that gradual habit can help too. So a detox could be helpful depending on the situation, or the replacement piece. But again, digging on the behavior, the feeling beneath the behavior. Does that help? Kind of? She's like, I've heard better. Sorry again for keeping you. Any other questions before we wrap? Fentanyl, we're good? All right. Thank you guys. Thanks, Nancy.
Abuna, do you want to pray for us?